All right, so at least more than half naman ta sa entire class na. So before we begin, let me just introduce once again the class, Readings in Philippine History. What we're going to talk about now is the introduction on why it's very important for the Philippine, especially the young generation, to know about the real history of the Philippines. Now, there are a lot of things that has not been included in the context of history, and these are the things that we are going to talk about. Because for young students like you, kamo ang magsunod sa amo, ano, and you will be the beacon of hope. Understanding history, understanding the past, whether it's good or bad in the Philippines, is very important for the growth and development of this country. So anything that had happened in the past, whether it was known or not, should be included and should not be revised or ato siyang dungagan or kuhaan. It's because there are things that could cause something bigger and something troublesome in the future if dili na to present ang history as what really happened. No? Of course, there are things that we have to consider. When writing history, most of the time, no, historians when nagsulat, nagi na siya pagka-subjective. But history is being conducted now in scientific manner. So natin mga historical researches that before it present an event in the past, an important event in the past, this has been checked properly and has been deliberated through scientific manner. No? So dili lang kay tungod na hitabo siya sa past, and then even if we know that it's very important, ato siyang i-include dayon-dayon. We have to make sure that what we presented are evidence-based. It follows scientific processes. Kay mo na siya maghatag og legitimacy sa ato ang case may present or in a manner sa history or sa event na nahitabo. Okay? Now, before going on to our first discussion, let me just remind everybody, nagsugod naman mag-submit sa ako, ano, sa inyong mga output. Since nagsugod naman mag-submit, please next time, butangan ninyo yung subject, sa subject line ba sa inyong email, butangan ninyo video section. Tungod guy, dili lang kamo nga ko ang ko, ano, gihandlean, na kay 1.4 and 1.5. So, unsahay basi malibog ko or dili dayon ako mo-open ang inyong document nga gi-attach. So, mas maayo nga sa heading parandaan makita na nako kung sa mga section. Also, sa inyong ipang-submit, next time nga mo submit mo for week 2, di ba? Nag-send na mo ko sa inyong module for week 2. So, next time, inyong haragya akong i-attach sa the same email nga inyong gi-send sa kuha. Meaning, ipaagi rin ninyo og reply. Para usara ka thread na nanog, usara ka email ninyo ang ako ang makita. Dili kay every time na mag-submit mo, new email po siya. Kung sa inyong buhaton, just go over to your sent items and click on the first mail, the very first mail nga inyong gi-send sa kuha, and then attach your output for week 2 and the rest of the weeks na naay mga outputs. Okay? Nakuha ba? If you get it, just type 1. Okay, good. All right, so now for our online sync, we're given at least 1 hour, no, more or less. So what we're going to discuss is just everything is very important that you will use in the future, especially if we take the board exam and in life as well. Okay? So let me present back the module. I've sent this already, but it's very important na to siyang i-present again and then discuss. All right? Nako ihatag sa inyo ang link sa Multimeter. Ako lang i-erase sa inyo ang question, no? And then you just provide your answer on something. Okay? Let me copy the code. And if you can access to Minty, go to multimeter.com. Okay? So, ako lang i-type din code. And let me share my screen. That's the code for Multimeter. If nakita ninyo sa chat box, just go ahead and go to Multimeter and then tell me if you are there. And let's see if this works. The question is, how do you define history in your own idea? Mara na siya. Write anything that you like. As much as possible, one word lang, no? Para at least dili kayo siya nga nakataas na natong makita sa word cloud. So if you're there, again, just try to type something and tell me if it's working. Okay, so now, wala pa sa makita. For those who cannot access, it's okay. Just type your answer in the chat box. What do you mean by history for you? So I've seen one here, recorded past events. Okay, good. What else? Bias. Okay, this is very interesting. May bias, which is still correct, no? There are biases in historical writing. What else? Comment kayo ang bias dali. Past events, correct. Everything in the past. Past events, subjective. Important facts, historical, right? Series of past events, historical, okay, more. Everything in the past, subjective, recorded past events, study in the past. So far, bias quite get the center stage, no? Dako tayo siya. For those who have not accessed on the Minty, inyo lang i-type dito sa chat box ha, so that you can also participate and we'll just read it again. So maybe 2 minutes or 1 minute na lang before we proceed. So if this is everything, knowledge, right? Empirical, correct. It follows scientific procedures. Past events. Napay muhabol? Okay. Remarkable story, that is correct. It is what built us, right? Okay, 30 seconds and let's wrap it up. So kung napay mo dungag, pwede pa mo dungag. At least you can put 3 times. So pwede pa mo dungag. Alright, so far, sa makita ninyo sa Multimeter, natay dako kayo ng word for bias. It is correct, no? In writing history, we have to acknowledge that there are biases because these are written by people, human being. And biases or subjectivity is understood by many of the historians. That's why when writing historical accounts, no, especially when you collect books of important events in the past, it has to follow scientific procedure. Dili lang kay muadto ka, no, naminaw ka sa mga tao nga nakita nimo dito, then imong gisulat, then imong i-publish. No, that's not the case. You have to make sure that you have proper evidences or sources of history that could prove that what you have written is actually accurate. All right? And even so nga imo na siya nakuha first hand from somebody, there are chances that the event that happened in the past nadungagan na siya or nakuhaan na siya. Okay? So, in writing historical researches, it's very important na tagaan na to siya og dako nga value ang subjectivity. All right? Another one, knowledge. Okay, now, knowledge, it's very important to get knowledge dili lang sa unsay gi-present sa tuwa karon, but also what have been written or even wala na sulat no? Orally lang siya na-transmit because these are knowledge sets that we can use in solving problems in the present and of course in the future as well, no? Say for example, if we do not take history in consideration, we won't be able to have progress in our society. All right, we won't be able to have vaccines for COVID-19 if our scientists did not check on the history of that particular virus. Right, these are actually evolutions of series of SARS-CoV. Now, we are still in continuation of trying to solve the problem, and it's very important that day-to-day basis we are learning from what happened, no, in the past. It's very important. Yes, it's what built us because history is the story of every important creation, important events, important historical knowledges that has been placed maybe in archives, in libraries, so on and so forth, right? Ancient, yes, of course, no, we are considering a lot of things from written to non-written history. Okay, we also have memories, yes, but let me tell you that not all of the memories or the past that we've been through can be considered in history. Okay, so dili tungod kay dahil nahitabo nga maayo sa tuwa or maybe pati sa tuwa ato siyang i-consider nga history na siya. No, history are important events that has impact in the lives of the many people across the globe. Okay. What else? Empiricals. What I said earlier, it follows scientific processes. Okay, so these are everything that you basically know, maybe from your elementary years, from your high school years, and now you are using it in our discussion as you enter college. All right. So again, let me close Menti, and let's go back to the main page. All right. Sorry, no. It's a series of historical events, a study of the past, valuable events. History is the root of occurrences, right? Sequential record of the past. That is right. Let me just read this one. Good day, Professor. I apologize for not being able to attend our synchronous class today. This is because I'm still suffering from cold and fever, and I cannot go outside to find a place with a stable internet connection. So I wonder, how did you post this one, June? But anyways, yeah, don't worry, just get better, okay? What else? This one. History is a science of facts that all happened in the past, which are truly remarkable, right? Okay. Now let's go and try to introduce to you the subject, the readings in Philippine history, and let's talk about its introduction. Basically, this is just a motivating part, on trying to get something from you on how far have you learned history from your exposure since day one when you go to school or when you were in school until today. All right. So let me present your module. So we are going to define the meaning of history, the purpose, and its theories. All right. We're going to discuss why it's very important to know history, what's the purpose of history, and the theories behind history. All right, so there are quite a lot of definition on what is history. All right. Originally, the word history is associated with the Greek word historia, which means information. We also have here history is the record of one age finds worthy to note in one another. Say for example, just like what I said, not everything that happened in the past should be recorded. It has to be noteworthy, meaning something that can help the society to grow, prosper, and develop. All right. For Johnson, history in its broadest sense is everything that ever happened. But many historians would agree to this line. It's because, again, dili tanan nga nahitabo has been included, and you can find in historical books or in the archives or in the libraries, right? Or even in oral histories, because what is being transmitted from one generation to the other are things that are very important for the continuity of this civilization, okay? Humanity will cease or will stop if everything that happened, important events that happened in the past, is not being continued anymore, right? Of course, there are things in the past na wala na natin sa practice because it's not helpful anymore for the for today, no? But there are a lot of things in the past that's still transmitted and still working, and we are using it today. And thanks to our ancestors who gave us everything that we can utilize now. Okay. For Smith, the value and interest of history depend largely on the degree in which the present is illuminated by the past. For Rapson, history is a scientific study of the past happenings in all their aspects. So it included scientific study now. Okay. For Nero, we have history is the story of man's struggle through the ages against nature and the elements, against wild beasts and the jungle, and some of his own kind who have tried to keep him down and exploit him for their own benefit. Now today, modern history has gone beyond the traditional status of the antiquarian and leisure time pursuit. They're a very useful and indispensable part of man's education. It is more scientific and more comprehensive. It has expanded in all directions, both vertically and horizontally. It has become broad-based and attractive. According to modern concept, history does not contain only the history of the kings and the queens, the battles and the generals, but the history of the common man in his house and clothing, his fields and their cultivation, his continued efforts to protect his home and the heart, and to obtain a just government, his aspirations, achievements, disappointments, defeats, and failure. So this is another discussion of the history of the masses. If nakabantay mo sa ubos, the theory sa mga histories na ko ipa-search dito sa inyo, some of them, wala na ako giapil, no? So, manang ipa-search ako sa inyo, na yung mga great man view of history, natay katong the human nature view of history, so on and so forth. It included there in the great man view of history, Mongol, that the idea is that history is being made only by those popular people, the famous. And in our history books, if we take a look back from the very beginning where civilization started, most of the names that transpired there came from the very prominent people, no? In Mesopotamia, if you've heard about Hammurabi, right? Nebuchadnezzar, so on and so forth. In the Greek history, you have Herodotus, you have Alexander the Great. For Romans, you have the Caesars, right? So these are prominent people who have been included in our history and thought to be the basis on how history has been written. But in the modern era, right now, in the contemporary world, we are taking a look at a new perspective that history is not written and made by those powerful figures in history, but they are actually in partnership with the masses. Napoleon Bonaparte wouldn't have the success in bringing his empire as big as he can if wala say battalion that supports him, right? Alexander the Great, the same. Most of the prominent people won't have their success if we don't include the contribution of the masses. In the Philippine setting, this is still very new, no? And something that we have to acknowledge. Because if you take a look sa atong history book, especially pag human sa Spanish colonization, we started the Philippine history by acknowledging the first president, right? Emilio Aguinaldo. The second president, the third president, so on and so forth. We are basing the government, the history of the Philippines by the people who sat and still sitting in the government post. And everything else will follow, which still not entirely correct if the manner of discussing history now. Okay? So again, ato i-take out ang great man idea as if Kanasiyani exists sa una, which people believe to, but there are a lot of contradictions. There are a lot of criticism because it's not always that the great man theory, no, is mahitabo siya. Okay? So this is something that we have to discuss in the readings in Philippine history. That there are a lot of informative events in our past that has to be included, it's because importante kayo siya na mahibaw-an sa tao. Because mura siya kuan, no? Makahatag sa ato ang enlightenment na naman is something na mas nindot i-include po sa ato ang history than of acknowledging those people who we have known from the very beginning that they existed. That is right. But the contribution of the common people has to be included, the masses. Okay? So here, let's go over and let's talk about the elements of history. So history is completely inclined with politics, no? What government influences society, with economics, where money dominates and affects people. Most social classes are based on money, and money is usually what causes conflict in history. Up until today, right, our basis on power is basically on the manner of how much wealth a country has, right? So if you compare the Philippines versus China, basically, power, the power struggle of the two, mahataga na itong dako og value sa China, right? Because they have a lot of wealth. Religion, no? History talks about religion. Social, or the society, the social status between the class struggle of the upper and the middle class, and even the lowest class. We have intelligence and knowledge that has progressed in history. Art, like paintings and pictures produced throughout the course of time. Okay, so these are the elements of history. Just try to recall. Let me see. We're still following. If you're still following, can you type 2? Okay, great. Now moving on, let's talk about the history of social science and its relation to the fields of disciplines. It's not that long ago that history has been included in social science as one of the disciplines. It's because some of the critics of history is that history is not science because it does not follow scientific procedures. Until such time that there are sociologists and social scientists and historians who actually acknowledge the importance of introducing scientific processes in history. So everything that happened in the past has gone through a series of scientific processes. They've gathered as much as evidences as they can, and then put it into a context where the panel for approving that this important event in the past is really accurate and it really happened. Okay, so history and political science. This is the connection. So we have historians that merely concerned with tracing of history of political process by narration of episodes, but he has to learn the nature and fundamental political principles and the basic forms of political institution. Basically, political science talks about the history on the beginning of politics, right? From the Greek politics and even the ancient politics. Okay, the very beginning where civilization started, we can't call a civilization without its political system, right? Now, in ancient period, especially in Mesopotamia, politics and governance is basically intertwined with religion. So they call their leader as a god king, no, or a priest king, because they are not separating the idea that their king is also a religious figure, which is medium ba, no, that connects people to the divine. So most of the leaders in the ancient period are basically god king. In Greek as well, but later on in the Roman period, no, kasagaran sila is military ang ilahang ruler. Anyways, history and economics. So history is closely related to economics as the activities of a man in society and are very closely related with economic matters. Of course, there are several history that talks about economic progress of humanity, right? And the struggle of having access to our scarce resources is one of the most fundamental issues that that is concerning even up until today, right? So atong scarce resources is one of the most common na issue when we talk about
Matod ang bottle kay
history.
daghan to ay tumbler. Red ang color.
Hold on a minute now. Ato sang
Ano?
mute si ano. Thank you. Anyways, okay. All right, moving on. History and sociology, both history and sociology are concerned with the study of man in society and differed only with regard to their approach. Max Weber acknowledged the initial dependence of sociology upon history, although history too benefits from the interaction. We have history and psychology, history and geography. So there are a lot of things that you have to applaud to when we talk about history, especially with their connection to other discipline, right? Most of the time, when we talk about a subject, we have to go from the very beginning, right? So we have to talk about the past. Even the discussion is all about mathematics, but every now and then, history come handy because ma-introduce kina ang mga famous na mga mathematicians, right? Pythagoras, so on and so forth. So history and other disciplines are very important. That's why social sciences acknowledged history as part of the discipline, especially during the time history have adapted empirical or scientific processes. Okay. Now, next is we have the purpose of studying history. So if I'm going to ask you why we need to study history, ay isang pagbasa ni. Para sa inyo, can somebody, maybe at least one or two participants, to give us why we have to study history? Isa may makahatan o inyong gamay na idea, no? Just to have a conversation on why it's very important to study history. Mr. Daog, nag-hashtag separation of church and state. Yes, that is right. But during the ancient period, wala na siya na-separate. Okay, wala yung muhatag o inyong kaugalingong kuhain. Gamay ragod nga para sa inyo, anong importante man na atong hisgutan o ato ani siya studyhan ang history.
De la Ramente, sir.
Sige, Ms. De la Ramente.
It is very important to study history because if we know what happened in the past, we know why we are what we are right now, why our country is like this, like that. That's it, sir.
Okay, good. Now, but why we have not learned from the past? Because if we are learning from the past, why we're slowly progressing as human being? Why even if the powerful countries still have issues with neo-imperialism? Anong napamgyapon tayo mga concern? If we've already gone through with several wars because we are greedy, why up until today we are still having problems with war, with territorial conflicts? Why humanity haven't learned it yet? If history is really important, why are we not learning? Mr. Dao.
Dao, sir. Yes. That's because in context to your question, sir, I believe it's human nature. Because we human tend to forget the learnings we have in the past and revert back to our old ways. So that's why it is important to study history, for us to be reminded about the choices that we took before and its consequences to society. We study history to remind us every day what happened to us before in order to prevent it from happening again. But well, it seems like we've failed because it's still happening. That's all. Thank you.
That is right. No, that's very ideal. That's what humanity should do. The problem is every human being, or shall we say every race, has a different context and concept on what history is, right? For the Filipinos, our history is a struggle on how to be separated from our former colonial masters. And now for our new master, China, right? But for the context of Chinese, the Americans, they wanted to maintain their power as just like what they had before in the past. That's why we are still in conflict on how to resolve problems that arises in our world. It is because we do have different contexts on how we understand history. No, for the Filipinos, we're struggling to be known. We're struggling to be as equal as anybody. That's why Duterte wanted um, to be acknowledged by the Americans that we are not your little brown brothers anymore, right? Or we've never have been your little brown brothers. You just assume that we are your little brown brothers. The problem is the United States do not acknowledge the equality between our races, right? It is just correct, human nature. There are people who um, try to supersede everybody else. It's been known in history, but yet until today we still have that kind of conflict. Another question, no? If this is the mentality of every races across the globe, right? Um, the solution was to create an international organization, just like the United Nations. And even then, even we have the United Nations, a lot of policies that the United Nations crafted um, does not really apply to some of the superpower countries. China did not acknowledge the accord that the Philippines do have the right in the West Philippine Sea, right? Um, and China is more than willing to get away from the United Nations. The United States has its own agenda also in our seas. Okay, so even today that we have an organization, this organization is being factioned by many groups or mini organizations inside that organization. Those who can benefit more will actually join together, and the remaining countries who have no voice at all or no power will remain as their place where they can get more and more of their resources. Okay, so these are issues that concerns history that goes beyond our discussion in the Philippines, right? But again, good that we are discussing this because empowering the youth, no, is something um, that we can use in the future. Something you, as future educator, could also tell to your future students that history is very important in shaping who we are as Filipinos, right? We are dynamic, so every now and then we keep on changing, but we should aim on changing to the better side than of trying to just copy, trying to just survive. Okay. All right. Now let's go back to the next one. So these are the things that most of the historians would suggest why history is very helpful or history is very important, right? History helps us understand people and societies. History helps us understand change and how the society we lived in came to be. History contributes to moral understanding. History provides identity. Studying history is essential for good citizenship. And there are a lot more that we can get out from history, especially if we talk about the problems we have now with the pandemic. Without history, we might be in limbo, right? We might be having a lot of problems and we might be facing extinction. But great that we have our scientists and social scientists working hand in hand to check on the matter, why this kind of virus evolved and what are the things that we could use not to suppress or just to prevent the spread of this kind of virus. So history is very important. The outbreak of Ebola in Africa was caused by a virus when social scientists observe the society, because atong mga medical scientists, no, when they check on the Ebola, they kept on having the same problem. Ilahang natambalan, but then mubalik ra manghapon ang pag-spread. So they tap social scientists to study and so may gipangbuhat sa tao. So they check on the behavior of the African society, especially at the center of the outbreak. Naman nga naman. One thing they found out is that walay proper sanitation ng mga Africans, no? So they get water sa polluted and contaminated water, nadaghan kayo siyaw kanang fecal na mga bacteria, no? Gikan sa tao pag yun. All right? So pagtanaw nila, ang mga villages dito, wala gani sila bathroom or comfort rooms. Asa man sila dito sa river. No? And then they get the water they drink from the river as well. Okay? So without social scientists, without the observation, without the empirical evidences gathered by social scientists on the behavior of that particular village where the outbreak came from, then Ebola virus won't have any success at all. Even until today, some of the African countries are still having problems with Ebola, but they are being contained and they're being treated properly. It's because we have now proper evidences on how to deal with it. Okay? All right. So these are also some of the most important values or purpose of history. We have disciplinary value. We also have informative value, the cultural and social values, political values, nationalistic values, internationalistic values, educational value, intellectual value, its ethical value, and vocational value. Yun na siya basahon, no? Because these are the things na pwede naman siya mabasa and pwede rapot siya matagaan ako kaya para maigo na pang time. No? Now, let's talk about the theories of history. First is napagitawag na cyclical view of history. It's a socio-philosophical concept according to which the periodicity of history is based on the repetition or recurrence of social processes. Cyclical theories thus contributed to the development of the comparative historical method in the social sciences. So, in this theory, many believe that ang history is mubalik ra siya, mura ra siya usa ka cycle. Mura siya life cycle ba, no? Gulong ng palad, kumbaga. All right? But because of this also, many social scientists and historians were able to use it in a comparative historical and methods in social sciences. It's because they see in that naay repetition ang usa ka event sa kinabuhi sa tao or sa usa ka society or sa usa ka civilization. Okay? Dili mga exactly the same and replicated from what really happened to that particular society or for that particular people or for that particular culture, but yet it has the same manner that can be used in solving and trying to get solution to the present time and perhaps in the future too. Okay. Aside from cyclical view, we also have linear view of history, where time has the beginning, which is the creation, and the progresses in a straight line through God's dealings with man. After the creation, to the current and to an end fulfillment, the second coming of Christ. History has a direction. History is meaningful. It's quite religious, time-bounded, that there's a beginning and there's an end, the Alpha and the Omega, right? And mostly, so linear view of history, most likely this kind of theory is being developed during the medieval period, where the Western people, in its height of the knowledge, comes from the church. And since they view history as part of God's creation, so linear siya, not a beginning and not a ending. Okay? And the meaning of this kind of history is basically our concept of salvation and acceptance by God, going to heaven or perhaps going to hell. Okay? All right, so we also have the great God theory. The idea that gods are in control, shape, and direct things. They are the cause of the events that's happening in the world. This leads to fatalistic view of history and life. Time is often seen as cyclical or not important. Okay, since humanity, who believe the Great God theory, believes that our life is already predestined, meaning ang ato ang pagkatao is na siya padulungan. All right. So whether we like it or not, naagi ato ang purpose sa usa, and the way we are today, and the way what we choose from yesterday, today, and tomorrow, these are actually predestined, and God actually provided every decisions that we make, and will be making. All right. So muna siya the Great God theory, and if we wanted to have a basis, well, you can take a look at the Crusades, right? So people in this time believe that their life is predestined, and their purpose is to serve God. That life that they have on earth is basically just a life like a bridge and going to the paradise. Okay, that's why many of the knights and the cavaliers during the time march going to Jerusalem and get back Jerusalem, because the promise of the church, the promise of the Pope at that time is that when you go to this holy war, automatically you'll go to paradise. Okay, so everything that was taught in the Great God theory comes from the idea that everything that we do, everything that we make, these are actually predestined, and God actually planned everything for our lives. Okay. Next, we have the great man view of history. Now, this school of thought espouses that the great leaders are born, not made. These individuals come into the world possessing certain characteristics and traits not found in all people. These abilities enable them to lead while shaping the very pages of history. Under this theory, prominent leaders throughout the course of history were born to lead and deserve to do so as a result of their natural abilities and talents. So most of the time, people believe that what shaped history is that there are great people who are actually born to lead humanity. If you go back to the very beginning, most of the history that we have is based on the great contribution of these great people. Okay? So katong mga great man sa history has been taught to be the leader on shaping the history of humanity. If we take them out, then there won't be history down. Okay? If we put away the contributions of Alexander the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, the kings and the queens in Europe, then there won't be history at all. Because most of the writings is based on their great contributions, their great achievements, and even their demise. No? Look at King Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette, ang iyang wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, di ba? Even their demise, ang ilahang pagkamatay, it's still being written in history and still being acknowledged, baski pagdaotan ang ilahang nabuhat. Okay? So these are things that has existed in our history in view of the great people's lives, or I mean the great man's life, and then people view it that diha ta mag-base upon history sa kanak ng mga tao. But in contradiction, natin gitawag na the great people or the best people view of history. This is now the time where we include the masses. We include the common people in shaping and building the humanity's history. Okay? Say, for example, the EDSA revolution. Okay? We keep on reading and understanding and hearing that there are heroes in the EDSA revolution, right? Cory Aquino, Ninoy Aquino, and the rest of the prominent people who stood up against the Marcos regime. But without even knowing that these are just few people who stood against a tyrant. But many of those who have not been known are actually seen and being videotaped in the streets, in EDSA, in the universities, and others are actually gone, right? Ipanglubong sila during the atrocities of that regime. Okay? But yet, wala tayo siya na-emphasize sa una. Sa karon naman na nagpang-emphasize na to, no? That the EDSA revolution does not necessarily mean that it is associated with the yellow ribbon or with Cory and Ninoy, but it is associated with the masses, with the people who gathered in EDSA, who peacefully conducted a revolution in order to ouster Marcos. Okay? Now, there are plenty of contributions of the masses that needs to be included. And one of it are these examples in the Philippines. Okay? Next, let's talk about the ideas of the great mind view of history. People believe that history shaped by the people who have its brilliance. From the Greeks, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. From the medieval period, we have Augustine, so on and so forth. No? From the Enlightenment period. So, katudang mga bright nga mga tao, moro ni siya nag-shape sa history, who actually invented machines, who pushed through the Industrial Revolution. So sila ang nahimong basis. Okay? Now, we also have the human nature view of history. Duharagi daw ni siya, the good and the bad. And this keeps on repeating every now and then. It's because it's human nature. And of course, in the history of humanity, what we highlight are actually the good contributions of humanity, right? Of course, we still include the bad things that happen, but it's not entirely seen or readable in many of the books available or written manuscripts available. Okay? Of course, no? Kung ikaw tao, magsulat ka, tanan bang batik na nahitabo sa imong kinabuhi imo ang isulat? I think walay mo basa ana. Because it's very depressing, right? So what most historians do is to highlight the successes, the achievements, its milestones, right? So mo na siya. We also have economic view of history. It's very popular now, the Marxist view of history, historical materialism, where history is based on material things. And then the material things is actually the resource, right? And because of this scarce resource, people are divided into classes. We have the ruling class and the proletariat or the working class. All right. Also, we have the gender history, where the tagaag emphasis that's not always men or his story, right? But there are a lot of women that should be given and acknowledged in writing history and their contribution. That's why this is very new, no, that we are highlighting the contributions of many women historical figures in the past. All right. Now, the postmodern view of history is actually a contradiction to the modern view of history, especially during the Enlightenment period, during the Scientific Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. Atong mga nanggawas ng mga highlights at ng mga time on what history is being contradicted with the postmodern view of history. All right? Para sila, history is not being directed by people. History is not being directed by very important events, but history is being directed on what is being given on that particular time. Okay? Sige. We already have 1 minute. Maybe extend another 5 minutes now. Do you have any questions? Let's see. History is being neglected sometimes because people focus on the present. Okay. Pwede pa di ay ni magbalik? I don't know. Anyways, sige. Anybody from the class, do you have any questions in mind? At least 5 minutes na. Mag-end at 9:35, if it's possible. Ako sang stop ni sharing na to. Napa? Clarifications? Usually, no, kung face-to-face din siya, we're given 2 hours. So, basically, sa 2 hours, dagan-dagan gid kaayo tayo dapat may sagutan. But what we highlighted now, it's very important. Some of the mga discussions na pwede na to i-highlight. At least, no, using online platform in delivering instruction, matagal na to siya value. Okay? If there's none, I think we have to meet 2 weeks from now, or yeah, 2 weeks from now, no? For our third online sync. Sige, Mr. Daog, just send to me the picture, ha, for my documentation.
Yes,
And
sir.
if you can send also the recording, much better. Kaya kung na pong i-upload sa YouTube, just go to my YouTube channel. Tanawan naman yung mga discussion nato. Ako naman yung gibuhat para sa discussion nato. Okay?
Okay, sir.
Sige. I'll end our online sync. Nice meeting not all of you, but hoping that others also would find time and a way, no? Para magkita na ninyo. And probably, bas hindi ra madugay, mag face-to-face na. So, magkita-kita na ninyo sa school. Alright? So enjoy the rest of the day and keep on learning. I'll see you.
Thank you, sir.